In 2003, a remotely operated drone descended nearly 1,500 feet into the freezing, pitch-black waters off the coast of Norway and carried out a mission no one had attempted in nearly 6 decades. Its task was simple: scan the interior of U-864, a German submarine that had been resting on the ocean floor since the final months of World War II. But what its cameras revealed stunned everyone involved. Hidden between rusted compartments and buried beneath decades of sediment were sealed military containers that had never appeared on any official cargo record for the submarine. Containers that, according to every known document, should not have been there at all. Within 72 hours of the footage reaching the surface, the Norwegian government quietly classified the entire wreck site, banned all fishing within a 3-mile radius, and contacted British naval intelligence, something they hadn't done since the Cold War. Because what that drone captured inside the wreck didn't just explain why a Nazi submarine had sunk in those waters. It revealed why 3 governments had spent 60 years making sure nobody ever looked inside. The Discovery North Sea, off the coast of Fiji, Norway, February 2003. For months, fishermen in the area had been reporting the same strange problem. Their nets kept getting caught and ripped apart in the same patch of ocean, about 12 nautical miles offshore. Something massive was sitting down there, something deep, about 1,500 feet below the surface, that kept shredding equipment every time a net passed over it. Eventually, the Norwegian Coastal Administration sent down sonar equipment to map whatever obstacle was causing the trouble. At first, they assumed it might be a lost shipping container, maybe an unusual rock formation. But when sonar operator Erik Solheim reviewed the scan, he stared at the screen in silence for nearly half a minute. Then he finally spoke. The shape on the display was unmistakable: a submarine, and not just any submarine, a large one. It was lying partly on its side in the seabed mud, surprisingly well preserved. Despite spending almost 60 years underwater, the hull looked mostly intact. Even the conning tower was still recognizable. When investigators compared the coordinates with historical naval records, they identified it almost immediately. The wreck was U-864, a German Type 9D2 U-boat that had departed Bergen, Norway, on February 5, 1945. It was a submarine British intelligence had once been desperately trying to locate. A submarine that had vanished before completing its mission. But the real shock came during the environmental analysis. When survey teams examined the area around the wreck, their instruments began flashing warning signals. Mercury, not small traces, not minor contamination from equipment. Massive levels. Dr. Hilda Ellingson, the lead environmental scientist on the project, reviewed the data and immediately called an emergency meeting with coastal authorities. The readings weren't just above normal levels. They were thousands of times higher than what is considered safe. The seabed around the wreck had effectively turned into a toxic dead zone, and investigators quickly discovered why. Before leaving Bergen in 1945, U-864 had been loaded with 67 tons of mercury. That's 134,000 pounds of liquid metal, sealed in steel containers that had been slowly corroding on the ocean floor for nearly 6 decades. One by one, the flasks were cracking open. Mercury was leaking into the currents, spreading poison through one of Europe's most productive fishing regions. The Norwegian government immediately shut down the entire area. Naval historians were called in. Hazard material experts arrived. Deep-sea salvage specialists joined the investigation. Everyone had the same questions. Why would a Nazi submarine carry that much mercury? Where was it supposed to go? And what else was hidden inside the wreck? Because investigators soon realized something disturbing. Mercury might have been the least dangerous thing on board. If you've made it this far, the story is about to take a darker turn. What investigators uncovered next reveals a chapter of history that stayed buried for more than 60 years, and very intentionally. And this is only the beginning. Operation Caesar. To understand what happened, we need to go back to February 1945. Germany was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing from the east. American and British forces had already crossed the Rhine River. Everyone knew the outcome of the war was inevitable. Within a few months, Berlin itself would fall. But the Nazi leadership wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. After the 2003 discovery, researchers began reviewing newly declassified German and British naval documents. What they found made the mercury cargo seem almost insignificant. U-864 wasn't just a supply submarine. It was the centerpiece of a secret operation known as Operation Caesar. The plan was simple but desperate. Germany would send some of its most advanced military technology to Imperial Japan. In return, Japan would provide critical raw materials Germany could no longer access due to Allied blockades and the 67 tons of mercury. That was basically camouflage. Yes, mercury was valuable. It was essential for detonators, electronics, and industrial manufacturing, materials Japan badly needed. But the mercury also served another purpose. It hid the real cargo. During 2 weeks of secret nighttime loading at the naval base in Bergen, crates were brought aboard the submarine under heavy armed guard, and the manifests didn't tell the full story. The submarine was commanded by Korvettenkapitän Ralph Reimar Wolfram, an experienced officer who had already completed multiple patrols. His crew consisted of 73 sailors. They understood the mission was likely one way. By the time they reached Japan, if they reached it, Germany would probably already be defeated. Still, the cargo was considered so important that the mission had to happen. But even the crew didn't know everything that had been loaded onto their submarine. Dock workers in Bergen later reported unusual security measures. Crates arrived at night. Documents were signed by officers who outranked the base commander. Some crew members even wrote letters home describing the strange situation. Letters that were later intercepted and archived by German military censors. They mentioned something none of them had seen before: extreme secrecy. For what was supposed to be a simple transport mission, the level of security was extraordinary. Whatever they were carrying, someone high up in the Nazi command structure wanted it delivered no matter the cost. The plan was ambitious. U-864 would travel north along the Norwegian coast, slip into the North Atlantic, then journey south around the Cape of Good Hope before heading across the Indian Ocean to Japan. The route would avoid most Allied patrol areas, but it was a staggering distance, more than 12,000 nautical miles without refueling. The voyage would take months. If they survived, British intelligence knew the submarine had left Bergen. They had partial information about the cargo, and they immediately issued orders to locate and destroy it before it could escape into open water. But U-864 never made it past Norway. The hunt. In the freezing waters off the Norwegian coast, a British V-class submarine was already waiting. HMS Ventura. Inside the cramped steel hull, the air smelled of diesel fuel, sweat, and damp metal. Condensation dripped from pipes and bulkheads as the submarine crept silently through the icy water. The crew knew a German submarine was somewhere nearby. They just didn't know exactly where. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary submarine battles in naval history, a moment that had never happened before and has rarely been repeated since. A submarine hunting another submarine, while both were submerged. The steel hull creaked under the crushing pressure of the sea. Every small sound inside the submarine echoed through the tight compartments. Even breathing felt dangerously loud. Lieutenant James Launders stood at the navigation table, steadying himself against the bulkhead with one hand. His instructions were clear. A German U-boat was trying to slip out into the Atlantic. Find it. Stop it. The date was February 9th, 1945, just 4 days after U-864 had left Bergen. At exactly 8 o'clock, the hydrophone operator aboard the British submarine HMS Venturer suddenly picked up something through his headset. A distant mechanical rhythm. Propellers. He signaled immediately. Contact bearing north-northwest. Both submarines were already submerged. And this is where things became extraordinary. A battle no one thought possible. In 1945, attacking another submarine while both were underwater was almost unheard of. Submarines were designed to hunt surface ships. Fighting another sub deep beneath the ocean meant firing torpedoes at a target you couldn't see. No visual confirmation, no radar lock, just sound, mathematics, and instinct. To succeed, a commander had to predict the enemy's course, speed, and depth, then launch torpedoes toward where the submarine might be minutes later. Until that day, no one had ever successfully done it. Launders made the decision to track. For 3 hours, HMS Venturer silently followed U-864 through the dark water. 3 hours of near-total silence. Crew members moved carefully, in stocking feet, so their boots wouldn't make noise. The deeper they went, the colder the submarine became. Moisture dripped from pipes overhead. Nobody spoke unless absolutely necessary. The only clue to the enemy's position was the faint, rhythmic pulse of the German submarine's propellers through the hydrophone. But there was a complication. U-864 kept changing its course and depth. Its captain, Ralph Reimer Wolfram, clearly knew something was following him. The submarine zigzagged constantly, diving deeper, then rising again, turning slightly off course. It was textbook evasive maneuvering taught to submarine commanders everywhere, and ironically, it created a pattern. Launders noticed it. Every few minutes, the German submarine would shift depth, make a turn, then eventually return to roughly the same course. Predictable, almost like clockwork. Launders began timing the intervals with a stopwatch, plotting possible positions on a navigation chart while the crew watched in silence. Later, the navigation officer would recall something remarkable. The pencil in Launders' hand never once shook. Finally, at 12:12, Launders gave the command. Fire! 4 torpedoes launched from HMS Venturer in a spread formation. Each one was aimed not at where the German submarine was, but at where Launders believed it would be over the next 3 minutes. No visuals, no confirmation. Just calculations scratched onto a chart. And 4 weapons racing through the black ocean. The moment of impact inside HMS Venturer, the crew waited. 1 minute passed. Nothing. 2 minutes. The hydrophone operator pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. Then they heard it. An enormous explosion. Moments later came additional blasts, secondary detonations. Through the water came the unmistakable sound of metal tearing apart, bulkheads collapsing, and finally the haunting groan of a submarine breaking apart as it plunged toward the ocean floor. One of Launders' torpedoes had struck U-864 near the forward section. The pressure hull ripped open instantly. Water rushed inside with catastrophic force. At a depth of roughly 1,500 feet, escape was impossible. There was no time to surface, no chance to blow the ballast tanks. The pressure outside the submarine was overwhelming. All 73 sailors aboard U-864 died within seconds. In that moment, Lieutenant Launders achieved something unprecedented. For the first time in naval history, one submerged submarine had destroyed another submerged submarine. A battle fought entirely through mathematics, in total darkness beneath the ocean. But Launders had no idea what he had actually prevented. To him, it was simply another successful patrol. Another enemy U-boat eliminated. The true significance of that mission would remain hidden for decades. What the drone eventually revealed. For nearly 58 years, U-864 remained where it sank, resting silently on the seabed, forgotten among countless other wartime wrecks. Then came the remotely operated vehicles. When Norwegian authorities finally sent deep-sea drones to explore the wreck in detail, each new discovery became more alarming than the last. Why so much mercury? The submarine had been carrying 67 tons of mercury. At first, historians assumed it was simply an industrial shipment, but the quantity didn't make sense. There was another explanation. Mercury plays an important role in precision detonation systems used in atomic weapons. An atomic bomb requires perfectly timed explosive triggers to compress the nuclear core and start the chain reaction. In early designs, mercury switches and detonators were essential components. In 1945, both Germany and Japan were pursuing nuclear research. Germany possessed advanced scientific knowledge but lacked enough uranium. Japan, on the other hand, had access to uranium through territories it controlled in Asia but struggled to develop the necessary technology. The arrangement was simple. Germany would send knowledge and specialized equipment. Japan would eventually provide uranium in return. Norwegian naval historian Dr. Magne Holland later analyzed the shipment quantities and reached a chilling conclusion. Once he calculated how many detonators 67 tons of mercury could support, he realized something disturbing. This wasn't an industrial cargo. It was connected to a weapons program. But mercury wasn't the most dangerous thing aboard that submarine, not even close. The hidden technology among the cargo were two complete jet engines from Germany's revolutionary Me-262 fighter aircraft. At the time, the Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, dramatically faster than anything the Allies possessed. Japan had been desperately trying to obtain this technology. Along with the engines were crates filled with advanced optical gun sights, torpedo components, infrared fuses, and stacks of engineering drawings representing years of German military research. But the cargo wasn't just machines. There were also passengers, German engineers, physicists, and technical specialists who understood how to build and operate the equipment on board. They were essentially living blueprints, capable of teaching Japanese engineers everything Germany had learned. Even that would have made U-864 one of the most important submarine missions of the war. But investigators kept finding more. The uranium hidden in cargo labeled simply as optical equipment were containers holding uranium oxide. Not enough for a weapon by itself, but valuable material for research. If delivered successfully, it could have accelerated Japan's nuclear experiments. In 2005, British historian Peter Hennessy examined newly declassified naval archives and matched cargo codes from captured German documents with known supply chains tied to nuclear research. When he realized what the codes meant, he reportedly leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. In that moment, he understood something. The British government had known about this mission. And there was a reason. The wreck of U-864 had remained classified for so long. But even the uranium wasn't the most disturbing discovery. The biological weapons. When the deep-sea cameras eventually reached the rear cargo section, they illuminated something that had never appeared on any cargo list. Several sealed German military containers. Inside them were cultures of anthrax bacteria. The drone pilot guiding the ROV, a contractor named Lars Grindal, reportedly stopped the scan immediately and radioed the surface ship. He told his supervisor they needed military authorities involved, because what he was looking at was not mentioned anywhere in the salvage brief. Germany had been researching biological weapons since the 1930s. Experiments with anthrax, botulism, and other deadly pathogens had been conducted in secret, sometimes using prisoners in concentration camps. Scientists had even developed bombs capable of spreading infectious agents over wide areas and contaminating water supplies. Publicly, Adolf Hitler had declared that Germany would never use chemical or biological weapons. But the cargo, hidden inside U-864, suggested that behind the scenes, a very different plan may have been unfolding. And the deeper investigators looked, the more it seemed that this submarine wasn't just carrying supplies, it might have been transporting the building blocks for some of the most dangerous weapons programs of World War II. The claim that Nazi Germany had abandoned chemical and biological weapons was largely propaganda. In reality, the program was well-funded, deeply organized, and actively producing weaponized agents. And by early 1945, as the Third Reich began collapsing, that research was packed onto a submarine and sent toward Japan. And that's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Why the cargo mattered. Japan already had its own biological warfare program. Known as Unit 731, it operated out of Manchuria and had been conducting horrifying experiments since the late 1930s. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases like plague, cholera, and anthrax. Scientists observed how the illnesses progressed in living human subjects. Unit 731 even developed weapons. They dropped ceramic bombs, filled with plague-infected fleas, onto Chinese cities and deliberately contaminated water supplies with cholera bacteria. In many ways, the Japanese program was already advanced when it came to deploying biological weapons, but there was something they lacked: industrial-scale production. Germany, on the other hand, had developed sophisticated methods for producing and preserving biological agents in large quantities. And that knowledge was exactly what U-864 was carrying. Inside those sealed containers were not only anthrax cultures, but also extensive documentation, detailed research explaining how to mass-produce biological agents, how to stabilize them for storage, and how to distribute them effectively using aerosol delivery systems. In other words, everything Japan needed to scale up its biological weapons program dramatically. And the most frightening detail? U-864 was only the first shipment. German records later revealed that several additional missions were planned to transport biological materials and scientific expertise to Japan. If the war in Europe had lasted just 6 months longer, the consequences could have been unimaginable. The silence. After the war. Once the war ended, British naval intelligence locked away everything connected to U-864. The public explanation was simple. A British submarine had sunk a German submarine during wartime patrol. End of story. But behind closed doors, British intelligence officers knew the truth. They had captured German naval records. They had interrogated surviving U-boat personnel from other crews. They knew exactly what had been loaded onto that submarine before it left Bergen. Mercury, jet engines, uranium material, and biological weapons research. Admitting that Nazi Germany had been sending biological weapons to Japan would have raised some uncomfortable questions. Questions about what happened to the scientists who created those weapons. And the answers weren't exactly reassuring. The scientists didn't disappear. After World War II, many German scientists were quietly recruited by Allied nations. Through programs like Operation Paperclip, the United States brought hundreds of German experts to America, rocket engineers, weapons designers, and specialists in advanced military technology. Some of them had worked directly on controversial or dangerous research programs. The Soviet Union ran its own version of the same effort, capturing and relocating German scientists to work on Soviet military projects. Britain also absorbed a number of specialists. None of the victorious powers were eager to publicly discuss the fact that former Nazi weapons researchers were now working for them. So the wreck of U-864 remained hidden. Its location stayed undisclosed. The cargo details stayed classified. Even the remarkable achievement of HMS Ventura, the first underwater submarine-on-submarine kill in history, was largely minimized in official records. And that wasn't accidental. When naval historians tried to publish detailed accounts of the Ventura patrols during the 1960s, they were told certain operations remained restricted. Which raises an obvious question. Why would a routine submarine sinking remain classified for 20 years? The answer is simple. Because it wasn't routine at all. The Cold War connection. During the Cold War, both superpowers built massive biological weapons programs, and some of that research was built on foundations originally explored by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Revealing the full story of U-864 might have forced governments to admit how much of that knowledge had survived the war, and simply changed hands, so the story stayed buried. Only in the early 2000s, long after the Cold War had ended, and most of the people involved were gone, did the documents begin to surface. A narrow escape. What makes the story of U-864 so chilling is how close the world may have come to something even worse in the final months of World War II. Japan's Unit 731 had already killed hundreds of thousands of civilians through biological warfare experiments. They knew how to weaponize diseases like plague, cholera, and anthrax. What they lacked was the ability to produce these agents on an industrial scale and deploy them efficiently. Germany was sending them exactly that knowledge, and the solution was traveling across the ocean aboard one submarine. If U-864 had reached Japan, German scientists could have joined forces with Unit 731. The final year of the Pacific War might have looked very different. Could Japan have deployed anthrax against American troops preparing to invade Okinawa? Against Allied forces during the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands? We know they discussed those possibilities. They had the delivery systems. The only limitation was production capacity. Germany was sending the missing piece of that puzzle, and the submarine carrying it had been at sea for just 4 days when a British torpedo found it in the dark waters of the North Sea. The shot that changed history, Lieutenant James Launders, had no idea what he had stopped that day. When he ordered those 4 torpedoes fired on February 9th, 1945, he was simply carrying out his mission: find the enemy submarine, destroy it. But by doing so, he may have unintentionally prevented one of the most terrifying scenarios imaginable during the final phase of World War II. The wreck today. Nearly 80 years later, the wreck of U-864 still rests on the ocean floor. The mercury continues to leak slowly, contaminating the surrounding waters. The biological containers have almost certainly deteriorated over time, and inside the shattered hull remain the remains of 73 sailors, young men who followed orders for a mission whose full purpose many of them likely never understood. For more than 60 years, the truth about what they were carrying stayed hidden, not because it was forgotten, but because governments on every side had reasons to keep it buried. It took a deep-sea drone to break that silence. When that drone looked inside U-864, it didn't just uncover a sunken submarine. It revealed why the Allies classified the wreck as top secret, why the biological weapons race accelerated after 1945, and how one torpedo fired blindly in the cold waters of the North Sea may have saved countless lives. And even now, the wreck still lies down there in the dark, still leaking, still holding some of its secrets. If this story changed the way you think about the final months of World War II, tell me in the comments what shocked you the most. Was it the biological cargo, the decades-long cover-up, or the fact that Lieutenant Launders never knew what he had prevented? And if you want more hidden stories from history, the ones that stayed buried for decades, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Because this isn't the only secret still resting on the ocean floor.